In this episode, we will give a high-level account of the politics of cryptography. This will be extremely coarse, but the objective is just to introduce the idea that cryptography can be employed to pursue a variety of political ends. To illustrate this, we'll be using the political compass, which is a methodology created to liberate us from thinking along the traditional left-right spectrum, which is admittedly ill-defined and doesn't generalize well. The political compass is a two-dimensional model taking its axes from the Nolan chart. In the Nolan chart, the question is, how much freedom should a society have in the personal and economic spheres? If a society lacks both personal and economic freedom, it ends up in the authoritarian section because both would be state-controlled. North Korea is here. If a society offers personal freedom but no economic freedom, it goes into the liberal section. The Scandinavian countries are good examples. Societies with economic freedom but no personal freedom are placed in the conservative sections. Hey there, Singapore! With both economic and personal freedom, a society is considered libertarian. There are few such countries, but historically, the United States before the 1930s and Hong Kong until recently would end up here. The political compass uses the same dimensions, but rotates the charts 45 degrees so that the quadrants are different. Instead of the four sections we had before, we now have left and right authoritarian and left and right libertarian. Libertarianism is defined as the belief that personal freedom should be maximized, while authoritarianism is defined as the belief that authority should be obeyed. The political compass got so popular online because it's not just used to understand nations or political parties, but thanks to a great memeing culture, just about anything. If you want to take the test yourself, check the link in the description below. In a nutshell, libertarians believe that in politics, liberty is the most important value. Liberty means being free to make your own choices about your own life, that what you do with your body and your property ought to be up to you. Other people must not forcibly interfere with your liberty, but you must also not forcibly interfere with theirs. Of course, almost everyone wants freedom for themselves, but libertarians also seek to protect and expand the freedom of others. The early public cryptography proponents were libertarians. Let's hear from Chuck Hamill, one of the cypherpunks, on why cryptography was a libertarian dream. For a fraction of the investment in time, money, and effort I might expend in trying to convince the state to abolish wiretapping and all forms of censorship, I can teach every libertarian who is interested how to use cryptography and abolish them unilaterally. Okay, so quite the impassioned speech from the mathematician Hamill. Let's have a closer look at three things that stand out here. 1. Hamill deplores wiretapping, which is how they used to refer to governmental snooping, and all forms of censorship. So his libertarian concerns are with the civic rights to privacy and free speech. 2. He's not just pointing out deficiencies in the state, but weighing the strategies on how these deficiencies can be remedied. 3. The pros of teaching cryptography isn't just its efficiency, but also that it can be achieved unilaterally, that is, without permission or agreement from the authorities. Reclaiming power from central authority is an important objective for libertarians, and cypherpunks reached for cryptography to do it. Cypherpunks were also part of a broader movement to define information as a free resource that should be accessible to all. They saw it as a prerequisite for more abstract social needs like liberty, democracy, egalitarianism, and as a vital ingredient for more personal needs like physical safety and self-fulfillment. Cypherpunks see information as the raw material from which new information is made and on which technological and economic progress depends. As such, everyone benefits the most when information is a public good, just like air and roads. This is a tenet of the cypherpunk belief system. So, on the political compass, cypherpunks obviously are at the libertarian end, but I'm going to place them in the left quadrant. It was a very diverse group, so there would have been members from all quadrants, but the focus on information as a public good and the call to collaborate on cryptography together leans, in my opinion, more left libertarian. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency whose value is derived entirely from scarcity as a tool for trade. This is unlike value derived from being legal tender, like any fiat currency where the state controls the money supply. In most nations, the state controls the printing presses for their currencies, so they can print as much money as they please. With an algorithmic limit on the total supply of Bitcoin, Bitcoin resists this state manipulation by design. But what made Bitcoin launch cryptocurrencies into the stratosphere was that it was the first digital currency to solve the double spending problem without the need of a trusted authority or central server. What's the double spending problem? So for example, let's say you have one coin in your digital wallet, but you're feeling cheeky, so you spend that coin to 2 other people at the same time. Unlike physical money, this is possible since a digital coin is just bits and bytes. So who would actually have that coin, and how would they find out without having to rely on a central authority which keep track of who owns each coin? Exactly, that's a hard problem to solve. But you can see how Bitcoin solving this problem endeared the technology with libertarians. Because compared to something like PayPal credit, people have had the ability to make digital payments for years, but the central authority was the sticking point. Over the years, PayPal has blocked accounts of human rights groups, Pornhub, entrepreneurs, and the cypherpunk darling WikiLeaks. So it's not hard to see why a centralized payment provider is antithetical to the libertarian ideal. So with both governmental and corporate centralized authorities sidelined, Bitcoin takes its place on the libertarian side of the political compass. It ends up in the right libertarian quadrant because, as a cryptographic technology and community, it's focused on supporting sovereign individuals engaging in free market exchange. So, with representatives in the 2 bottom quadrants, let's look at the authoritarian half. If libertarians use cryptography to make centralized power obsolete, how are authoritarians using cryptography to strengthen their hold on power? The auth-right quadrant embraces the free market, so companies are allowed to operate in an environment free from invasive regulations. The internet infrastructure, services, and sites are all offered within this competitive and private environment. So by default, user data should not be available to a central government. But I bet you know where this is going. Okay, let's look at the United States and see how the federal government there uses its federal agencies to entrench its power with cryptography. The first method is by weakening cryptography. See, cryptography doesn't mean strong cryptography. It just means that an attempt is made to keep information private with a cipher. If the cipher is weak, then it will be easier to break. And thanks to the Snowden leaks, we now know that the NSA lobbied the National Institute for Standards and Technology to include a compromised algorithm into one of its encryption standards. The algorithm was responsible for generating the random numbers which cryptographic applications depend on as inputs to make their secrets unguessable. But as the NSA could determine which random numbers were used as inputs, they could regenerate the secret key and break the encryption. The second method is by installing backdoors. So the story of the predictable random number generator continues, as the NSA paid $10 million to a security firm to use it in their security suite. This security suite was used by many other companies in their encryption toolchains. So by compromising a key component of the cryptography stack, the NSA had potentially weakened all of the encryption that used that not-so-random number generator for its cryptography. The third method is by convincing companies to hand over their encryption keys. It's unclear how successful this approach has been, but the case of the San Bernardino shooting is illustrative. Following a shooting in which 16 people died, including the 2 shooters, the FBI made a very public appeal for Apple to hand over its encryption keys so the shooters' phones could be unlocked. Under oath, the FBI claimed that there were no other methods feasible for gaining access. When Apple refused to cooperate, the FBI's head appealed that the encryption should be compromised so that terrorists and child molesters could be stopped. This put a lot of public pressure on Apple, as the arguments were made that they were putting profits before safety and that this really had nothing to do with privacy. So, when Apple still refused, within 2 weeks, the FBI had unlocked the phone through other means. Their claim that there were no other feasible methods for gaining access proved to be fabricated and suggests that the FBI was merely looking to set a legal precedent against Apple. With such a legal precedent, tech companies could be expected to compromise encryption at a government agency's behest. While in this particular case, the government failed to assert its supremacy over cryptography, but as the off-right is wont to do, they continue to court public opinion and implore tech companies to open up to the authorities. In the off-left quadrant, so that's states leaning towards a planned economy, there are much stricter controls on what companies can and cannot do. In off-left societies, internet infrastructure and services are a lot more regulated and held to strict standards. Let's look at the PRC, which offers a fascinating example of what an off-left approach to cryptography looks like. It has to be said, though, that the Chinese privacy context is radically different from the Western ones and is a much more recent development. It also doesn't help that the Chinese word for privacy, yinxi, has connotations of illicit secrets and selfish conspiratorial behavior. It also wasn't until 2010 that the right to privacy got legally enshrined in the tort liability law. Note that the tort law applies to physical and legal entities, but specifically not to the government. The cybersecurity systems rolled out in the PRC serves the political goal of making information opaque to bad actors, but transparent to the CCP. Cryptography is the key technology in achieving this, so let's see how it's being used. Firstly, the 2015 National Security Law states that all information systems in China must be secure and controllable. Practically, this means that every company operating in China, be it Chinese or international, are required to open their source code, encryption keys, and networks to the authorities for inspection. Secondly, many communication technologies outside of China offer end-to-end encryption. Practically, this means that the data is encrypted as it moves through the network from sender to receiver, and neither the app provider nor the infrastructure operator are able to read the data. But in the PRC, the 2015 counterterrorism law requires that companies hand over data on terror suspects. But if a company is using end-to-end encryption, it can't comply with this. So tech companies in the PRC eschew this level of security. That's why Chinese apps like WeChat and QQ don't support end-to-end encryption, while international apps which do, like WhatsApp and Telegram, have been banned from operating in China. Thirdly, you may have noticed that while iMessage does offer end-to-end encryption, it's not actually blocked in China. There is of course no official account for why iMessage has not been blocked, but the case is illustrative of the PRC's broader approach to user data. The cybersecurity law requires that foreign-owned companies host Chinese users' data inside of China. Apple, for example, complied with this law by not only moving its iCloud hosting to the PRC, but also moving the storage of their users' encryption keys. By default, Apple backs up iPhone users' photos, iMessage chat history, and encryption keys to iCloud, which in China is operated and hosted by China Telecom, a state-owned telco. This means that the Chinese authorities not only have a legal framework to access user data, they have the practical means to do so, as the data and encryption keys are both held by its subsidiaries. Okay, so to recap. The PRC legally has access to private sector systems for monitoring purposes. It has practically outlawed cryptography, which would have locked them out. It legally requires all of its citizens' data to be hosted within Chinese jurisdiction, and they control the network infrastructure where data can be intercepted. As representatives of the off-left, the PRC show how to combine the state ownership of infrastructure companies with strict information controls to ensure that all data is transparent to them, but opaque to bad actors. That's all for this episode. You've hopefully seen that cryptography is both math and ideology, that privacy is the choice to reveal oneself, and that cryptography can be used to shape the political realities in all quadrants of the political compass.